Stripped of her title and inheritance, Genevieve Sterling stood destitute in a London slum. While former friends mocked her fall, she did the unthinkable in the pouring rain. She gave her only umbrella to a shivering beggar. The world called her a fool for aiding a stranger when she had nothing, but the elite were blind to the truth. That beggar was actually England's most powerful woman in disguise. She had just decided that Genevieve's kindness was about to become a dangerous weapon against the people who destroyed her. This is the story of how a single act changed everything. The end of Genevieve Sterling's life as she knew it did not happen with a whimper. It happened with the shattering of crystal. It was the height of the 1884 season, a Tuesday evening that felt suffocatingly warm despite the November chill outside. The grand ballroom of Sterling Hall was a masterpiece of excess. 3,000 beeswax candles flickered in the chandeliers, casting a golden glow over the silks and satins of London's elite. At the center of it all stood Genevieve, 19 years old, her hand resting lightly on the arm of Lord Reginald Cavendish. Reginald was the sort of man who looked perfect in a portrait, but felt hollow in conversation. He was handsome, wealthy, and, as of 3 hours ago, her fiancé. "You are trembling, Jenny," Reginald whispered, his voice smooth like oil. "The eyes of the entire peerage are upon you. Smile. You have secured the match of the season." Genevieve forced a smile, though her corset felt suddenly tighter. "It is just the heat, Reginald, and perhaps the excitement." Across the room, her cousin, Beatrice, watched with eyes that resembled flint. Beatrice had lived at Sterling Hall since her own parents died in a carriage accident in York, and while Genevieve had treated her as a sister, Beatrice had treated Genevieve as a rivalry to be won. Beatrice wore a gown of dark crimson, a sharp contrast to Genevieve's pale ivory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Genevieve's father, Baron Archibald Sterling, boomed from the top of the grand staircase. He raised a glass of champagne, his face flushed with pride and perhaps a bit too much brandy. "To my daughter, and to the union of House Sterling and House Cavendish." The applause was polite, rippling through the crowd like a breeze through wheat, but the applause died abruptly as the heavy oak doors of the ballroom were thrown open with a violence that shook the floorboards. The music stopped. The chatter ceased. 6 officers of the Metropolitan Police marched in, their boots thudding heavily against the polished parquet. At the lead was Inspector Aberline, a real man, known in the darker corners of London for his unyielding grip on the law. He did not look like he belonged among the velvet and lace. "Baron Archibald Sterling?" Aberline's voice cut through the silence. "I am he," the Baron sputtered, descending a step. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a private engagement party." "You are under arrest, sir," Aberline stated, holding up a warrant. "For high treason, embezzlement of Crown funds intended for the naval expansion, and fraud." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. A glass shattered somewhere near the buffet table. "Preposterous!" The Baron turned pale, his eyes darting around the room, looking for allies. He found none. The guests, who moments ago were drinking his wine, were now physically recoiling, stepping back as if failure were contagious. "Take him," Aberline ordered. As the officers seized her father, Genevieve rushed forward, her skirts tangling around her legs. "Father, no, there must be a mistake." She grabbed the inspector's sleeve. "Please, sir, my father is a good man. He is a patriot." Aberline looked at her, his expression not unkind, but resolved. "The evidence is irrefutable, Miss Sterling, and I'm afraid the Crown has ordered the seizure of all assets to repay the debt. This house, the accounts, the jewelry, it is all property of the Crown as of this moment." Genevieve turned to Reginald, panic rising in her throat. This was her future husband. He would step in. He would use his family's influence to at least sort this out until morning. "Reginald," she pleaded, reaching for his hand. "Speak to them." Lord Reginald Cavendish looked at her outstretched hand as if it were covered in soot. He took a deliberate half-step back. "It seems," Reginald said, his voice loud enough for the nearest Duchess to hear, "that our engagement was premature." "Reginald?" Genevieve whispered, the blood draining from her face. "My family cannot be associated with traitors, Genevieve," he said coldly, smoothing his lapel. "Consider the proposal withdrawn." The humiliation was a physical blow. Tears stung her eyes, hot and sharp. She looked around the room, faces she had known her whole life. Lady Agatha, who had sat at her tea table yesterday, Sir Thomas, who had taught her to play chess. They all looked away. They studied the ceiling, their fans, their shoes. Suddenly, a laugh rang out. It was Beatrice. Beatrice walked toward the center of the room, not to comfort Genevieve, but to stand near the police officers. "I told you, Uncle," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy that barely masked her glee. "I told you that your gambling would catch up to you. I have already packed my trunks. I shall be staying with the Fairmonts. They have graciously offered me sanctuary from this disgrace." Beatrice turned to Genevieve, leaning in close so only she could hear. "I always knew you'd end up with nothing, darling. You were too soft for this world. And now, you are nothing." By midnight, the house was empty. The servants, unpaid and fearful of the scandal, had fled, taking silverware and candlesticks as payment. Genevieve stood in the foyer, a single valise at her feet. She had been allowed to keep 2 dresses and a locket that belonged to her mother. The great heavy door of Stirling Hall, the only home she had ever known, was locked behind her by a bailiff. She stood on the cobblestones of Mayfair. It had started to rain, a cold, biting drizzle that soaked through her thin silk shawl. She had no money, no fiancé, no family. She walked. She didn't know where else to go. She walked until the gas lamps of the wealthy districts faded into the darkness of the East End. Her silk slippers were ruined in the mud. She eventually found shelter under the awning of a boarded-up bakery on Fleet Street. She huddled in the corner, shivering violently. It was then that she saw her. A lump of rags across the alleyway stirred. It was an old woman, coughing a wet, rattling cough that sounded like death itself. The woman was exposed to the wind, her grey hair plastered to her skull. People hurried past, men in top hats coming from late clubs, women in heavy cloaks stepping over the woman as if she were a pile of refuse. One man even kicked dust at her to clear his path. Genevieve looked at her own valise. She had a wool shawl inside, her only source of warmth for the coming night. Everyone chose Cruelty, she thought. Beatrice, Reginald, the Ton. They all chose to save themselves. Genevieve shivered. Her heart was broken. Her life was over. But looking at that woman, she realized her humanity was the only thing the Crown couldn't seize. She opened her valise. She took out the heavy wool shawl. She walked across the muddy alley and knelt beside the pile of rags. "Here," Genevieve said softly. Her voice cracked. "Please, take this." The old woman looked up. Her face was smeared with grime, her eyes obscured by cataracts, or so it seemed. She stared at Genevieve for a long moment. She didn't say thank you. She simply reached out a gnarled hand and touched the silk of Genevieve's ruined sleeve. "You are cold, child," the old woman croaked. "Why give this to me?" "Because," Genevieve whispered, tears finally spilling over, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "It is the only thing I have left to give, and I do not want to be like them." She wrapped the shawl around the woman's shoulders, tucking the ends in to ensure she was warm. Then Genevieve retreated to her corner, hugging her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes, preparing to freeze. She didn't notice the carriage parked in the shadows down the street. She didn't see the crest on the door, a silver hawk clutching a rose, and she certainly didn't see the old woman's posture straighten the moment Genevieve fell asleep, nor did she see the signal the beggar gave to a footman standing silently in the dark. Genevieve Stirling had hit rock bottom, but she had just passed the first test of the Dowager Duchess, Margaret of Blackwood, a woman known in high society as the Iron Rose, and the mother of the most elusive, cold-hearted duke in England. And Margaret was looking for a bride, not for love, but for something much rarer. When Genevieve opened her eyes, the world was a grey, spinning blur. The rain had stopped, but the damp had seeped into the marrow of her bones. Her throat felt like it had been scrubbed with glass. She sat up, clutching her chest, and looked for the old woman. The alley was empty. The bundle of rags was gone, and so was her heavy wool shawl. A bitter laugh escaped Genevieve's lips, turning into a racking cough. Of course, she thought, she stole it. Even charity is a transaction in this city. She stood on trembling legs. She had to move. If she stayed here, the constables would arrest her for vagrancy, or worse. She picked up her valise, which felt heavier than before, and began to trudge toward Cheapside. She had a locket gold, with a miniature of her mother inside. It was worth perhaps £50, enough to rent a room in a boarding house and buy a hot meal. She found a pawnbroker with a sign that creaked ominously in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and desperation. The broker, a man with yellowed eyes named Mr. Silas, looked at the locket. 10 shillings, he grunted. 10 shillings? Genevieve gasped, her voice hoarse. That is 18-carat gold. The craftsmanship alone is 10 shillings for the gold. I ain't paying for sentiment, Silas sneered, tossing it back on the counter. Take it or leave it. You look like you need a meal more than you need your mummy's picture. Genevieve's stomach cramped violently. She had no choice. She reached for the coins, her hand shaking. Wait. The voice came from the doorway. It wasn't the voice of a customer. It was authoritative, crisp, and undeniably upper class. A footman in a dark blue livery stood there. He didn't look at the pawnbroker. He looked straight at Genevieve. Miss Genevieve Sterling? Genevieve froze. Who asks? My mistress requests your presence. Immediately. I have no mistress, Genevieve said, clutching the 10 shillings. I have no one. She believes she has something of yours, the footman said. He stepped aside, gesturing to the street. Outside, the carriage she had missed the night before was waiting. It was a sleek, black brougham, the horses snorting clouds of steam into the cold air. The crest on the door, the silver hawk and rose, gleamed. Genevieve knew that crest. It belonged to the Duchy of Blackwood. The Blackwoods were older than the monarchy and twice as rich, known for their reclusiveness and their immense, terrifying influence. Fear warred with exhaustion, but exhaustion won. She allowed the footman to help her into the carriage. The velvet interior was warm, smelling of lavender and beeswax. Sitting on the opposite bench was not the Dowager Duchess, but a woman in a severe grey dress, a housekeeper. She handed Genevieve a flask. Drink. It is broth. Genevieve drank. The warmth hit her stomach like a blessing. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, moving away from the slums, back toward the manicured squares of Belgravia. They did not stop at the main Blackwood residence. Instead, they pulled up to a discreet, ivy-covered townhouse on a quiet street. Genevieve was ushered inside, stripped of her ruined clothes by silent maids, bathed in hot water that stung her frozen skin, and dressed in a simple but high-quality gown of dove-grey wool. When she was finally clean, though feeling light-headed, she was led into a drawing room. Sitting by the fire, drinking tea from delicate china, was the Dowager Duchess Margaret. She looked nothing like the beggar. Her silver hair was coiffed high, her black silk gown was structured and imposing, and diamonds glittered at her throat. But when she turned, Genevieve saw the eyes. Sharp, assessing, and on the chair beside her lay Genevieve's wool shawl. You, Genevieve whispered, gripping the back of a chair for support. It was you. Sit down, Miss Sterling, Margaret said, pouring a second cup of tea. You look as though a stiff wind would knock you over. Genevieve sat, her mind racing. Why? Why would a duchess dress as a beggar in the rain? Because I am tired of liars, Margaret said, her voice steel. My son, Sebastian, is the Duke of Blackwood. He is 30 years old, possesses one of the largest fortunes in Europe, and is currently the most miserable man in London. He believes that every woman who smiles at him sees only his title, and he is largely right. Margaret took a sip of tea. I have introduced him to contessas, heiresses, and beauties. They all fainted at his feet, and they all flinched when things became difficult. I needed to find someone who possessed true character, someone who would sacrifice their own comfort for a stranger who could offer them nothing in return. She gestured to the shawl. I sat in that alley for 3 nights. Hundreds passed me. You were the only one who stopped, and you did it on the night you lost everything. Genevieve stared at the shawl. So, it was a test. A job interview, Margaret corrected. For what position? For the position of Duchess, Margaret said calmly. Genevieve choked on the air. You are mocking me. My father is a traitor. My name is mud in this city. I am penniless. I cannot marry a duke. Your father is a fool, but his crimes are his own. As for your name, the Blackwood name is strong enough to absorb any scandal. If you marry my son, society will not dare to shun you. They will bow. And the Duke? Genevieve asked, skepticism rising. Does he know about this interview? Margaret's lips thinned. Sebastian has given up on finding a wife. He has. Retreated. He gave me an ultimatum. If I find a woman who can survive 1 month at Blackwood Manor without running away in tears or trying to manipulate him, He will marry her. He believes such a woman does not exist. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze intense. I am offering you a deal, Genevieve. Come to Blackwood Manor. Stay for the season. Endure my son's temper, his cynicism, and the sharks of the ton who will try to tear you apart. If you succeed, you become the Duchess of Blackwood. You will have protection, wealth, and the power to never be hurt again. And if I fail, then I will give you £5,000 and safe passage to America. Genevieve looked at the fire. She thought of Reginald's cold rejection. She thought of Beatrice's laugh. She thought of the mud in the alley. She had nothing. She looked up at the iron rose. I do not want your son's money, Your Grace, but I do want to ensure that no one ever looks down on me again. Is that a yes? Genevieve straightened her spine. When do we leave? Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of stone, rising from the mists of the English countryside, 3 hours outside of London. It was beautiful, but in a jagged, imposing way. Gargoyles perched on the eaves, and the gardens were wild, overgrown with dark ivy and thorns. Genevieve stepped out of the carriage, the wind whipping her cloak. She felt small against the looming shadow of the estate. Do not let the house frighten you, Margaret said, stepping down beside her. It reflects its master, intimidating on the outside, but inside, well, it is mostly draughty. They were met in the great hall by a line of servants. They bowed low, but Genevieve caught the side glances. They knew who she was, the traitor's daughter, the pauper. Where is he? Margaret asked the butler, a man named Henderson, who looked like he had been carved from granite. The Duke is in the library. Your Grace. He gave orders not to be disturbed. Nonsense, Margaret said, marching toward the double oak doors. She pushed them open. Sebastian. The library was cavernous, smelling of old paper and brandy. Thick velvet curtains were drawn, blocking out the afternoon sun. By the fireplace, a man stood with his back to them, staring into the flames. He was tall, his shoulders broad, wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up scandalously informal. He turned slowly. Genevieve's breath hitched. Sebastian Blackwood was striking, with dark hair that fell over his forehead and a jawline that could cut glass. But his face was marred by a shadow, not a physical scar, but an expression of utter, exhausted disdain. He leaned heavily on a cane made of ebony, favoring his left leg. I thought I made myself clear, Mother. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the room. No more debutantes. Genevieve is not a debutante, Margaret said, guiding Genevieve forward. She is a guest, Miss Genevieve Sterling. Sebastian's eyes, the color of a stormy sea, locked onto Genevieve. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He walked toward her, the cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. Click, step, click, step. He stopped inches from her, invading her space. He smelled of sandalwood and smoke. Sterling, he mused, his voice dripping with ice. Ah, yes. The daughter of the man who sold our naval secrets to the Prussians. I read the papers. Genevieve felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't step back. My father's crimes are not mine. Your Grace. Are they not? Sebastian sneered. The apple rarely falls far from the rotten tree. Tell me, Miss Sterling, how much is my mother paying you to be here? Did she promise you a new wardrobe? A settlement? Sebastian, Margaret warned. No, Genevieve said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Let him speak. She looked Sebastian in the eye. Your mother promised me nothing but a roof over my head. Something, I might add, that was taken from me while people like you watched and did nothing. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being answered back. Most women giggled or cried when he used that tone. A roof, he scoffed, and in exchange, you play the part of the doting companion. You try to fix the broken Duke? He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You are wasting your time. I am not a project, Miss Sterling, and I do not like stowaways, and I do not like bullies, Genevieve shot back, but it seems we are both stuck in this house. So you can either ignore me, or you can treat me with the basic civility of a gentleman. Though I see you are struggling with that definition. Silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Margaret watched, hiding a smile behind her fan. Sebastian stared at Genevieve. For a second, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes before the cold mask slammed back down. Dinner is at 8, he said abruptly, turning his back on her. Do not be late. and do not expect me to make conversation. The first week was a war of attrition. Sebastian ignored her. He ate his meals in silence, reading a book while she sat at the other end of the 30-foot table. He left rooms the moment she entered them, but Genevieve did not hide. She explored the library. She befriended Henderson, the butler, by helping him polish the silver when the under-butler fell ill, an act that shocked the staff but earned their grudging respect. Then came the letter. On the morning of the 10th day, Genevieve was breaking her fast in the sunroom when Margaret entered, her face pale. "We have a problem," Margaret said, slapping a cream-colored invitation onto the table. Genevieve picked it up. It was an invitation to the Duchess of Kent's masquerade ball in London. "Why is this a problem?" Genevieve asked. "Because," Margaret said, "the guest list was published in the Morning Post. Beatrice Sterling is attending, and she is attending as the guest of Lord Reginald Cavendish." Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. Reginald and Beatrice, together. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "rumors are swirling. Beatrice has been telling anyone who will listen that you fled London to avoid arrest, implying you were complicit in your father's treason. She is trying to destroy the little reputation I have left," Genevieve whispered. "She is succeeding." A deep voice came from the doorway. Sebastian stood there, leaning on his cane. He looked at Genevieve, his expression unreadable. "If you do not show your face, society will take your silence as an admission of guilt. You will be branded a criminal forever." Genevieve looked down at her hands. "I have no dress, I have no jewels, and I have no escort. If I walk into that ball alone, they will tear me to shreds." Sebastian walked into the room. He stopped at the table and poured himself coffee. "You will not go alone," he said calmly. Genevieve looked up. "What?" "I despise balls," Sebastian said, taking a sip. "I despise the noise, the heat, and the hypocrisy. But I despise liars even more." He looked at Genevieve. "Your cousin sounds like a pest, and we have an infestation that needs clearing." He set the cup down with a clatter. "Get ready, Miss Sterling. We are going to London, and we are going to make sure that when you walk into that ballroom, no one, not your cousin, not your ex-fiancé, dares to say a word." He turned to his mother. "Open the family vault, Mother. She needs diamonds, the big ones." For the first time since she arrived, Genevieve saw a spark in the Duke's eyes. It wasn't warmth. It was the thrill of a hunt. He was going to use her to declare war on the Ton, and for the first time in her life, Genevieve realized that being the weapon of a dangerous man might be safer than being his enemy. But she didn't know that Beatrice had not come to London alone. She had brought something with her, a document found in the Baron's desk that could implicate not just Genevieve, but the Blackwood family itself. The masquerade was not just a party, it was a trap. The Duchess of Kent's masquerade ball was the apex of the London season. The ballroom was a swirling kaleidoscope of Venetian masks, velvet capes, and secrets whispered behind painted fans. At the center of the room, holding court like a queen, stood Beatrice Sterling. She wore a mask of black feathers and a gown of crimson silk that was cut daringly low. Beside her, Lord Reginald Cavendish looked smug, his arm draped possessively around her waist. "Is it true?" Lady Caroline whispered to Beatrice. "Is Genevieve truly on the run?" "Worse," Beatrice sighed, her voice carrying perfectly over the orchestra. "She was seen in the slums, bargaining with pawnbrokers. It is tragic, really. Some people simply do not have the breeding to handle adversity with grace. I fear she has descended into unsavory professions." A titter of scandalized laughter rippled through the group. "And to think," Reginald added, sipping his champagne, "I almost married her. It sends a shiver down my spine." Suddenly, the laughter died. The music faltered and stopped. The murmur of the crowd turned into a hushed silence that swept across the room like a wave. At the top of the grand staircase, the Master of Ceremonies slammed his staff onto the floor. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, and Miss Genevieve Sterling. Every head turned. Beatrice dropped her fan. Sebastian stood at the top of the stairs, magnificent in severe black formal wear, a simple black domino mask concealing his eyes but doing nothing to hide the hard line of his jaw. He radiated power, a dark gravity that pulled every eye in the room. But it was Genevieve who stole the breath from their lungs. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that shimmered as she moved, like the night sky brought to life. Around her neck sat the Blackwood diamonds, a necklace of legendary size and brilliance that had not been seen in society for 30 years. It was a statement of protection so loud it was deafening. Her mask was silver, delicate, and sharp. She did not look like a pauper. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a duchess. Sebastian offered her his arm. "Ready?" he murmured, his voice low and steady. "My knees are shaking," Genevieve whispered back, gripping his sleeve. "Let them shake. Just do not let them bow." They descended the stairs. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide avenue for them. Sebastian walked with his cane, but the limp only added to his menacing aura. He looked like a war god returning to a petty skirmish. They stopped directly in front of Beatrice and Reginald. Reginald's face was a mask of shock. "Genevieve?" he squeaked. You are with the Duke?" Sebastian looked at Reginald as if he were a stain on the carpet. "And you must be the man who abandoned his betrothed at the first sign of rain." "Lord Cavendish, is it?" "I would say it is a pleasure, but my mother taught me not to lie." Reginald turned red. "Your Grace, you may not be aware, but this woman is the daughter of a traitor. She is destitute." "She is my guest," Sebastian's voice boomed, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And anyone who insults her, insults the House of Blackwood. Unless, Lord Cavendish, you wish to challenge me on that point?" Reginald swallowed hard. "Challenge the Duke of Blackwood? It would be social and financial suicide." "No, Your Grace. Of course not." Beatrice, however, was not so easily cowed. Her eyes flashed with hatred. She stepped forward, her voice sweet and poisonous. "It is lovely to see you, cousin. And how clever of you to find a new protector so quickly. Tell me, Genevieve, did you find the Duke in the same alley where you were sleeping last week?" The crowd gasped. Genevieve felt a flash of shame, but then she remembered the old woman in the rain. She remembered the kindness that had brought her here. She stepped away from Sebastian's protection and faced her cousin. "Yes, Beatrice," Genevieve said clearly. "I was in an alley, and I was cold, and I was alone because you took my home. But in that alley, I learned the difference between value and worth. You have a title, Beatrice, and you have my father's money, but you are the poorest person I know." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She reached into her reticule. Brave words. "But I wonder if His Grace will be so protective when he sees this." She pulled out a folded, yellowing paper. "I found this in my uncle's desk," Beatrice announced, holding it up. "It is a letter from the Baron to a Prussian contact, and it details the transfer of funds. But look at the signature on the authorization." She handed the paper to Sebastian. Sebastian took it. He read it. His face went rigid. The color drained from his skin. "What is it?" Genevieve asked, panic rising. Sebastian looked at her, his eyes suddenly distant, a wall of ice slamming down between them. "The authorization," Sebastian said, his voice hollow. "It is signed by my father, the late Duke." The room erupted into chaos. Beatrice smiled triumphantly. "It seems," Beatrice purred, "that the Sterlings and the Blackwoods were partners in treason. Your father stole the money, Genevieve, but the old Duke laundered it. By harboring her, Sebastian, you are not protecting an innocent. You are covering up a conspiracy." Sebastian crumpled the paper in his fist. He looked at Genevieve, but he didn't see her. He saw the betrayal of his own legacy. "Is this true?" he demanded, turning on her. "Did you know?" "No," Genevieve cried. "Sebastian, I swear." "Leave," he snarled. "What?" "I said leave," Sebastian roared, the pain in his voice terrifying. "Get out of my sight," Reginald laughed. The crowd jeered. Genevieve stood frozen, the diamonds around her neck feeling like a noose. She had been raised high only to fall twice as far. She turned and ran. She ran through the ballroom, down the stairs, and out into the London night, the echoes of Beatrice's victory ringing in her ears. Genevieve did not go back to the slums. She went to the only place left, the Church of St. Jude in the East End, where the vicar ran a shelter for the destitute. She traded the velvet gown for a simple linen dress and scrubbed floors for her keep. She had left the Blackwood diamonds on the table at the townhouse before she fled. She would not be called a thief. For 3 days, she worked in silence, her heart a bruised stone in her chest. She missed the warmth of the library. She missed the dowager's sharp wit. God help her. She missed Sebastian's grumpy silence. Meanwhile, Blackwood House was a tomb. Sebastian sat in his study, a bottle of whiskey half empty on the desk. The letter Beatrice had produced lay smoothed out before him. "You are a fool," Margaret said from the doorway. She was leaning on her own cane now, looking older than her years. "The evidence is there, Mother," Sebastian said bitterly. "Father signed it. We are ruined. If this goes to the Crown, they strip us of everything." "Your father," Margaret said, walking into the room, "was many things. He was distant, he was arrogant, and he was cold. But he was a patriot. He would sooner cut off his own hand than sell secrets to Prussia." "Then explain the signature," Sebastian shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "It is his hand. I know it." "Then it is a forgery," Margaret said calmly. "And a good one. But you were too busy feeling sorry for yourself to ask the right questions." "And Genevieve?" "Genevieve left diamonds worth a king's ransom on a table and ran into the night with nothing," Margaret snapped. "Does that sound like a co-conspirator to you? You let the opinions of sheep like Reginald Cavendish dictate your actions. You threw her to the wolves because you were afraid." Sebastian stared at the whiskey. He remembered Genevieve in the library, standing up to him. He remembered her in the ballroom, trembling but standing tall against Beatrice. "I realized my humanity was the only thing the Crown couldn't seize." That was what she had told his mother. He stood up. "Where is she?" "I don't know," Margaret said. "But you better find her, because the police are coming for her. Beatrice has filed a formal accusation that Genevieve was the mastermind behind the Baron's accounts." Sebastian grabbed his coat. "Beatrice Sterling has overplayed her hand." "How so?" "Because," Sebastian said, his eyes hard, "she produced that letter too conveniently, and she forgot one thing about my father." "What?" "My father suffered from gout in his right hand for the last 5 years of his life," Sebastian said, a dangerous smile forming. "He signed all official documents with a stamp or with his left hand, which was shaky. This signature, it is perfect. It flows. It was written by a right hand in perfect health." He grabbed his cane. "I'm going to find her. And then, I'm going to burn Beatrice's world to the ground." Genevieve was scrubbing the altar steps when the doors of the church banged open. She didn't look up. "We have no food left until the morning donation," she said wearily. "I am not here for food." The voice made her drop the brush. She turned. Sebastian stood in the aisle, illuminated by the dusty light filtering through the stained glass. He looked exhausted, his cravat undone, mud on his boots. "Sebastian," she whispered. He walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was kneeling on the stone floor beside her, ruining his trousers. "I am sorry," he said. The words were rough, unused to being spoken. Genevieve shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "You had reason to doubt. The letter is a lie," Sebastian said fiercely. "And I was a coward. I let my fear of the past destroy my present. You are the only honest thing I have found in this city, Genevieve, and I threw you away." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. "Come back, not as a guest, not as a project, then as what?" "As my partner," Sebastian said. "Help me destroy them." Genevieve searched his face. She saw no deception there, only a burning intensity. She took his hand. "Beatrice is smart, Sebastian. She will have covered her tracks." "She is smart," Sebastian agreed, helping her stand. "But she is arrogant, and she has a maid." "A maid?" "The footman who drove you to the pawnbroker," Sebastian explained. "He has been courting Beatrice's maid, a girl named Tilly. Tilly has been complaining that her mistress has been practicing calligraphy late into the night, practicing signatures." Genevieve's eyes widened. "She forged it. She needed a way to ensure I wouldn't help you," Sebastian said. "She knew that implicating my father was the only way to make me recoil. She studied us." "Then we need proof," Genevieve said, her mind sharpening. "We need to catch her doing it." "I have a plan," Sebastian said, "but it requires you to walk back into the lion's den, one last time." Genevieve smoothed her linen dress. She thought of the fear she had lived in for weeks. She was done with fear. "When do we start?" The Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey was not merely a building. It was a theatre of judgment, a cavernous hollow of dark wood and stifling heat where reputations were led to the slaughter. On this Tuesday morning, the air inside was thick enough to choke on a heavy soup of unwashed bodies, stale perfume, and the electric, copper-tasting scent of anticipation. Every bench in the gallery was packed. Ladies of the ton who had shunned Genevieve weeks ago now jostled for position, their fans fluttering like the wings of agitated moths. They were vultures, here to pick the bones of whichever reputation fell first. Genevieve sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned the color of old parchment. She wore grey, a somber, serious color that made her look like a steel blade amidst the chaos. Beside her, the Duke of Blackwood was a silent, brooding monolith. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the judge. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set in a line of granite determination. Across the aisle, in the front row of the gallery, a seat of honor usually reserved for the grieving family, sat Beatrice Sterling. She was a vision of curated sorrow, dressed in layers of expensive black mourning silk. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, occasionally whispering to Lord Reginald Cavendish, who sat beside her looking increasingly pale and sweaty, like a man realizing he had bet his fortune on a lame horse. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The Honourable Justice Wargrave entered, a man whose face was as lined and severe as the law itself. He adjusted his wig, banged his gavel, and the room fell into a silence so profound one could hear the scratching of the stenographer's pen. The prosecutor, Sir Arthur Pumblechook, was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice. He paced before the jury, waving the damning letter like a conductor's baton. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sir Arthur began, his voice dripping with theatrical outrage, "we are not merely discussing embezzlement today. We are discussing the deepest betrayal of the Crown. We have before us a document, irrefutable, tangible proof that the late Duke of Blackwood conspired with the disgraced Baron Sterling to funnel funds to our enemies." He slapped the paper onto the railing. And who stood to benefit? The Baron's daughter, Miss Genevieve Sterling. She claims ignorance. She claims innocence. Yet, she wears diamonds while her father's victims starve. Genevieve flinched, but she felt Sebastian's hand brush against her arm, a silent, searing promise of support. "Miss Sterling," Sir Arthur turned to her, his eyes predatory. "Do you deny that this is your father's handwriting? Do you deny that he possessed an intimate relationship with the late Duke?" Genevieve stood. Her legs felt like water, but she forced her chin up. "I do not deny that my father knew the Duke, Sir Arthur, but I deny the content of that letter. My father was a gambler, perhaps a fool, but he was not a traitor to England. And neither was the late Duke of Blackwood. The signature speaks for itself," Beatrice cried out from the gallery, unable to contain herself. She stood up, her mask of mourning slipping to reveal the venom beneath. "I found it myself, hidden in the Baron's secret ledger. It proves everything." "Order!" Justice Wargrave roared, banging the gavel. "Miss Sterling, you will be seated, or I will have you removed." Beatrice sank back down, smoothing her skirts, a smug smile playing on her lips. She believed she had won. She believed the narrative was hers. Sebastian slowly rose to his feet. He moved with the deliberate, terrifying grace of a predator who has finally cornered its prey. The courtroom hushed. The Duke of Blackwood rarely spoke in public. When he did, it was an event. "Your Honor," Sebastian's voice was a low rumble, carrying to the furthest corners of the gallery without effort. "The prosecution builds its entire case on a single sheet of paper. A sheet of paper conveniently discovered by a woman who publicly vowed to see the defendant ruined. The document has been authenticated by the bank," Sir Arthur sneered. By a bank clerk who glanced at it for 3 seconds, Sebastian countered smoothly. "But the truth, Sir Arthur, requires a closer look. The defense calls a witness." "We have no more witnesses scheduled," the judge grumbled, peering over his spectacles. "This is a witness for the Crown, Your Honor, though the Crown does not yet know it," Sebastian said. "I call Miss Tilly Evans." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Beatrice froze. Her head whipped around, scanning the back of the room. The doors opened, and a small, trembling figure was ushered in by the court beadle. It was Tilly, Beatrice's former maid. She looked terrified, clutching her bonnet as if it were a shield. She walked to the stand, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, refusing to look at the woman she had once served. Beatrice's face drained of color. She gripped Reginald's arm so hard he winced. Sebastian approached the witness box. His demeanor changed instantly. He was gentle, soft-spoken. "Miss Evans, thank you for coming. I know you are frightened, but you are safe here. No one can hurt you." Tilly nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Miss Evans, you served as the personal lady's maid to Miss Beatrice Sterling for 3 years. Did you not?" "Yes, Your Grace," Tilly whispered. "And why did you leave her employment 3 days ago?" I was dismissed, sir. Why? Tilly took a shuddering breath. Because I asked her about the burning papers, sir, the courtroom murmured. Tell the court, Sebastian commanded gently. What papers? It was the morning of the masquerade ball, Tilly said, her voice gaining a little strength. Miss Beatrice had been up all night. The gas lamps were still burning. She was sitting at her vanity, but she wasn't doing her hair. She was writing, over and over again. She had a piece of glass with a light under it, and she was tracing something. Lies, Beatrice shrieked, leaping to her feet again. The girl is a thief. She is a liar and a thief. I fired her because she stole my earrings. Sit down. The judge's shout shook the walls. Two bailiffs moved toward Beatrice, forcing her back into her seat. Sebastian ignored the outburst. What was she tracing? Tilly. A signature, sir, Tilly sobbed. She had an old dinner invitation from the old Duke. She was tracing the name Blackwood onto a yellow piece of paper. When she saw me, she threw the practice sheets into the fire. But one didn't burn all the way. I saw it. It looked just like the letter the lawyer man is holding. The gallery erupted. The vultures began to whisper furiously. The tide was turning, the water receding from Beatrice's feet. This is preposterous, Sir Arthur sputtered. The testimony of a disgruntled servant is hardly proof of forgery. Perhaps not, Sebastian said, his voice turning hard as flint. But science is. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a thick, leather-bound folio. He walked to the judge's bench and placed it down with a heavy thud. These, Sebastian announced, are the private medical journals of Dr. Silas Halloway, the royal physician who attended my father in his final years. Sebastian turned to face the jury, and then, slowly, he turned his gaze to Beatrice. My father, the late Duke, suffered a severe stroke in the winter of 1879, Sebastian declared, his voice ringing out like a bell. It left him with partial paralysis on his right side. For the last 5 years of his life, my father could not hold a pen with his right hand. He signed all documents with a specialized stamp, or, on rare personal occasions, with his left hand a scrawl that was barely legible. Sebastian walked over to the prosecution's table and snatched the forged letter. He held it up to the light. Look at the ink flow, Sebastian demanded. Look at the slant of the letters, the loops of the B and the K. Any calligraphy expert will tell you this was written by a right-handed person with a steady, fluid grip. It is a masterpiece of penmanship, and it is a physical impossibility for the man who was supposed to have written it. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hovering at the top of its track. Sebastian turned to Beatrice. You forged this letter. You framed a dead man. You tried to destroy your own cousin, and you were willing to drag the name of a duke through the mud to do it. You are not a victim, Beatrice. You are a criminal of the highest order. Beatrice looked around wildly. Reginald Cavendish was actively scooting away from her on the bench, looking at the ceiling, the floor, anywhere but at her. The society ladies who had hung on her every word were now looking at her with undisguised revulsion. She crumbled. I had to, Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. She had everything. Even when she had nothing, she acted like she was better than me. She deserved to lose it. She deserves to rot. Arrest that woman, Justice Wargrave ordered, his face dark with fury, for perjury, fraud, and defamation. As the bailiffs descended on Beatrice, she began to wail a high, thin sound that grated on the nerves. She was dragged from the gallery, kicking and screaming, her expensive mourning silk tearing on the bench. Reginald Cavendish buried his face in his hands as the judge slammed his gavel down. Case dismissed. The defendant is exonerated on all counts. Pandemonium broke out. Reporters shouted questions. The gallery surged forward. But inside the well of the court, the noise seemed to fade into the background. Sebastian turned to Genevieve. The cold, hard mask he had worn for the trial melted away, leaving the man beneath tired, relieved, and undeniably in love. It is over, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Genevieve let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a month. Her knees finally gave way, and she slumped against the table. Sebastian was there instantly, his hands gripping her shoulders, steadying her. My name, she whispered, looking at him with wide, wet eyes. It is clean. It is, Sebastian nodded. You are free, Genevieve. The nightmare is done. I suppose, She looked down at her simple grey dress. "I suppose I must find employment now. Perhaps the vicar needs a permanent housekeeper." Sebastian laughed, a low, genuine sound that seemed to startle the nearby clerks. "Employment? You think I went through all of this just to let you walk out the door and scrub floors?" He took her hand. His thumb traced the line of her knuckles, callous from her days in the shelter. He didn't care about the audience. He didn't care about the proprieties. Right there, in the center of the Old Bailey, amidst the scattered papers and the lingering dust of the battle, the Duke of Blackwood dropped to one knee. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The reporters stopped writing. The barristers stopped packing their briefcases. "Sebastian," Genevieve breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You told my mother you wanted to ensure no one ever looked down on you again," Sebastian said, looking up at her with an intensity that burned. "You told me you didn't want my money. You wanted respect. You wanted kindness." He squeezed her hand. "You saved my family from a lie that would have destroyed us. You showed me that honor is not about titles, but about the choices we make when we are in the mud. I am a difficult man, Genevieve. I am cynical, I am moody, and I come with a drafty castle." He paused, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "But I love you. I love your courage. I love your stubbornness, and I cannot imagine walking back into that empty house without you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not the massive Blackwood diamond, but a simple ring, a band of gold set with a single, clear sapphire. "Be my wife," he asked, "not for the title, not for the protection, but because there is no one else in this world I wish to stand beside." Genevieve looked at the man who had found her in an alleyway and treated her like a queen. She looked at the ring, then at his face. Tears spilled over, hot and fast. "I don't want a duke," she choked out, a smile breaking through the tears. "I just want the man who gave me a chance." "Then you have him," Sebastian vowed. "Forever." He slipped the ring onto her finger. As he stood and pulled her into a kiss that silenced the entire British Empire, the courtroom finally erupted into applause. Not the polite applause of society, but the raucous, genuine cheering of people who knew they had just witnessed a true victory. Genevieve Sterling went from a muddy alleyway to the highest seat in British society, not by scheming, but by staying true to who she was when the world wanted her to become a monster. Beatrice Sterling died in prison, forgotten. Reginald Cavendish died a bachelor, bankrupt and alone. But the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood, they became legends. They opened shelters across London, ensuring no one would ever have to sleep in the rain again. If you loved this story of justice and romance, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a twist. And tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven Sebastian for his moment of doubt? Let's discuss below. Thanks for watching.